This is the moment I've finally been waiting for, sugar. Finally, Uncanny X-Men issue number 1 is out, and I cannot wait to break down this jumbo-sized issue with you and let you know my thoughts on it, because I have a lot, to be honest with you. Welcome back, Fin Gang. It's me, Amanda, aka Vamp. I'm not wearing my gloves, but don't worry, I won't touch anybody. And we're talking about one of the most highly anticipated comics of the year, at least for me, Uncanny X-Men issue number 1. This issue is written by Gail Simone with art by David Marquez, colors by the astounding Mathew Wilson. Gosh, I love his colors. Letters by VC's Clayton Cowles. Main cover is David Marquez and Mathew Wilson, but there are also a slew of other alternates available if there is, a different artist that you like. I'm going to be trying to get the Art Germ cover as well at Fan Expo, which is where I'm going to be headed after I finish filming this video, but I ended up picking up the Luciano Vecchio Rogue variant cover from my local comic shop, or, my LCS if you prefer, because I needed to have Rogue prominently featured on my cover. And I honestly love this return to a more 90s inspired kind of Jim Lee costume. In fact, this costume looks similar to my own cosplay that I'm doing. So I'm loving that. I'm loving that. I mean, even the belt, it has the little extra strap, and I have that too. So it's pretty cute. So how did this issue number 1, measure up in terms of that promise? How does it do with portraying Rogue and honestly everyone else? And overall, how do I feel about it? Would I recommend it? Let's find out. Friendly spoiler warning, it's been a few weeks, so I feel like probably everyone's read it by now that wanted to read it, but I am going to be giving you a brief synopsis before I dive into the nitty-gritty of specific beats and moments. We are going to be talking about all of the story here, so get ready for that. Spoilers incoming. This story is like multiple stories all rolled into one. I would say it's divided up into 3 or even 4 acts. Honestly, reading it felt like I was watching a movie, an X-Men movie. And you know how long many of us have been waiting for that. At least, one of those in the MCU. The issue starts off with a flashback back in the before time. Dr. Karina Ellis is shown taking possession of the X Mansion, and the comic begins to pull on our heartstrings a little bit as we see the mansion torn asunder and repurposed into a mutant prison, where inmate X, Charles Xavier, was held. Now, back in the present day, we pivot to some ridiculously big action, but I imagine more is being built here than just an awesome fight scene. We'll talk more on that later. Rogue here starts off with Gambit. The two are seemingly called in by Wolverine to fight a literal dragon god, Saturang, the god snake. Rogue has her confidence shaken somewhat during this fight, and she actually begins to question her place after everything that happened following the rise and fall of Krakoa. In the midst of all this is a glimpse into what feels like a horror story where another young mutant, Fawn, is being hunted by some kind of monster out in the wilderness. Meanwhile, Rogue's confidence is further affected after Gambit, Wolverine, and Rogue are all called to meet Nightcrawler and basically pay a visit to a new and physically unstable young mutant, Harvey X. Kind of like Make-A-Wish Foundation vibes here with the X-Men visiting Harvey X, who's in the hospital. This part of the comic just really pulls on our heartstrings, I feel like, when this young fanboy mutant, after meeting his heroes, the X-Men, suddenly passes away. Seeing that Rogue is really hurt after this, Gambit decides that they'd be best to get away from it all. And he and Rogue and Wolverine head out to New Orleans to a safe house owned by Gambit's friend Marcus, which seems to be like in the swamps, like maybe down by the bayou. Rogue questions what hers and the others' place is now and the importance of the X-Men after all of this. Does the world need this team? Who will step up to lead it? What about Xavier's dream? She seems interested in keeping the X-Men going, honestly, but Wolverine and Gambit question whether or not it might be time to rest after all that's happened. They are questioning whether or not they've, maybe done enough for a bit, instead of continuing to fight in what feels like an endless fight, something that ultimately they can't win. I mean, they kind of just lost. I mean, honestly, although they didn't ultimately lose, in a lot of ways, they did lose. They lost a lot in the fall of X. As the conversation starts to get heated, the 3 are then confronted by young mutants who emerge from the wilderness, terrified and seeking help. Mysteries abound in this issue 1, and honestly, a lot is set up here. a lot. When it comes to Uncanny X-Men issue number 1, I think what I love most about it compared to the other From the Ashes titles that I've read thus far anyways, X-Force, Phoenix, X-Men, NYX, that's what I've read so far. I just love its sense of carrying forward what has come before. It feels like the first book who is really delivered on creating a true through line from the Krakoan era to now. I can see the evolution of the characters, and this feels like it's honestly a continuation of that. And as a fan of the Krakoan era, as you may or may not know, I'm a big fan of the Krakoan era, I really appreciate that. That being said, the book still has, I would say, a classic feel that I think is carried throughout this sort of new era of the X-Men. It's got some vibes that feel very 90s, and I think that will appeal to readers as well. This book honestly also just feels the most X-Men of the 3 flagships thus far. Although, you know, to be fair, we haven't gotten Exceptional X-Men yet, so I will need to reassess when that drops. But in this moment in time, it's the most X-Men. It feels so X-Men that I actually had to remind myself when talking about it here to insert Uncanny whenever I say the title. Like when I was scripting this video, I kept wanting to write X-Men and I had to be like, Uncanny X-Men, Uncanny X-Men. I just want to say X-Men, but it's Uncanny X-Men. The start of this comic with all the action feels honestly pretty peak 90s, and really that brings that classic flavor that I was talking about. Combine that with some high stakes drama and tragedy, and you've honestly got a recipe for a 90s feel throughout this comic. But more on that later. We'll talk about that. We're going to come back to that. When it comes to the action, I love how this comic also is not afraid to start off really, really big. We're talking massive. This isn't just any old fight that's coming at us here. We are, in essence, fighting a dragon god. What the heck is happening? While a newer character as well, first appearing in 2019, I believe, it makes sense that Saturang would appear here since he was also co-created by Gail Simone. I'm very curious to see what happens when this character returns too, as now, you know, he owes Gambit a favor, he owes Gambit a boon. I'm excited to see where that's gonna go when that comes back around. One thing that I've noticed across most of the book is that they've all started with action, but I would say Uncanny and Phoenix have carried some of the highest stakes, in my opinion, thus far. Not only does this issue have a lot of action, but it also comes with a lot of intrigue, honestly. I'm curious to see the story that will unfold involving Charles and what happened in the converted X-Mansion. You know, we know some of that, but there's gaps, I think. Is the new prison possibly related to the monster that we see on the loose in this issue? Not only do we have the mystery of that monster, by the way, but we also have the little premonition given to us initially by Saturang and echoed again later by Harvey X before he passes, where he says, "They're coming. You have to help them. One of them is the Endling." Based on this issue 1, I'd guess he's referring to the mutant youngsters who are seeking out help from our heroes at the end of the issue. But of course, which one of them is the Endling? Dun dun dun. And what even is an Endling? Huh? The only reference I've seen to Endlings at Marvel Comics, or at least this is what I was thinking of, is the energy kind of vampire creatures who served the Griever at the end of all things, who of course appear in Dan Slott's Fantastic Four run early on. The Griever at the end of all things is one of those villains that I kind of loathe in some ways because of just immediate power scaling that we got with the Griever. I do like the design of this villain though, but I just wasn't a fan of how she was really used. But she did also reappear more recently in Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver and the new Scarlet Witch series. So perhaps this is all building to some kind of further development with the Griever, or perhaps it's a different kind of Endling that is being prophesied here. We'll have to wait and see. When it comes to our characterizations in this issue for our main cast, it's honestly pretty spot on. Or at least that, you know, that's how it feels to me as an X-Men fan. I really love the voices of all the characters in this, and it feels, like I said, like we are carrying on, you know, some of their evolutions from the Krakoan era. I'm mostly familiar with what Wolverine was up to because I've read like almost all of Wolverine. I haven't finished Sabretooth War yet, but I've read almost everything Wolverine from that era. But I also followed along with what Rogue and Gambit were up to there, just not as closely. Still, I love Gambit thieving it up here to defeat Saturang. Felt that was very Gambit and very fun. And I can feel that we're setting up like a really big overarching story for Rogue here in this issue, something that I'm personally really excited for, as during the Krakoan era, I will say both she and Gambit kind of felt more like supporting characters in most stories. Granted, I'm mostly familiar with them from the X-Men stuff, so I'm just eager to see her get some time in the spotlight and be focused on, and maybe just not be in a coma. That's always nice. I think some writers struggle sometimes to do this with Rogue, as while she is super complex and she's super interesting, she is a powerhouse. So it can be, I think, hard to build obstacles for her that she has to overcome, and it can be hard to figure out what to do with her. But that's also why I love that Gail Simone seems to be focusing more on the internal workings of Rogue, her internal struggles, her heart, her mind, her emotional core, and the struggles that come along with those parts of her. Something folks may not know about me, because I don't know how much I've talked about it on here or honestly on Top 10 Nerd, is that I am a huge Rogue fan. Rogue was my first love on the X-Men. She was my first favorite member. I have always been just super attracted to Rogue. I think because just of how tragic her character was, but also how often sassy and upbeat she seemed. Rogue doesn't take BS from anyone usually in the X-Men animated series, but she also is super emotional, and she's super vulnerable in that series. I love that she was not only immensely powerful, but that what made her strong was also somewhat of a curse, as she couldn't control her powers, which initially in the comics and the animated series meant she couldn't, touch anyone. Hence why she usually wears gloves. Not wearing them right now. My gloves are over there, but I digress. I think there was always some part of me that felt connected to her in that way, and I still feel that way today. I've always been super empathic myself, and I often take on the feelings of those who are around me. It means that I'm often allowed to connect more easily with folks, which is pretty cool. It is a power. I find it easy to put myself in other people's shoes and to empathize or sympathize depending on the circumstances with other people, even with people who to be honest, maybe sometimes don't deserve my sympathy, hence where sometimes this can become a bit of a curse. This is also probably what's made me well suited to being an actor and a performer as well, but also a streamer and a YouTuber. But it also, like I said, it's a bit of a curse, as it means I tend to carry others' emotions for them, which isn't always healthy. I have a tendency to overanalyze, and I often just feel my emotions a lot more deeply. So when I'm hurting, I'm really hurting. That being said, Rogue being the leader of the X-Men in this book obviously means a lot to me as someone who has been a fan for a very, very long time and has really looked up to Rogue as one of my favorite heroes. Although some, I think, were bothered by this, I also kind of love the interaction between Rogue, Gambit, and Wolverine following the defeat of Saturang. Okay, so let me give you my thoughts on this. Some people took this as Wolverine proposing a threesome, I think, with Rogue and Gambit, and it could very well be that, but it could also just be seen as, this looming threat of death, this prophecy that we just got, maybe making Logan want to spend some quality time with people who he cares about, especially after getting this bottle sort of at the beginning of the issue, the part that I didn't talk about. Wolverine gets this bottle from like an old war friend, is what it seems to be, who just passed away. And it seems more like he just wants to find a sense of family here again. But after the polyamorous implications of Krakoa, I would say that the intimate implications here could also fit. I think it's more of like a joke in that regard, but it could be that. Some people were bothered by that possible implication, but I'm personally a fan of the polyamory that was implied on the island nation of Krakoa. Sorry, but not sorry, Tom Brevoort. So even that doesn't really bother me if that's what's happening here. But most likely, I think this implication is, it's intended more as like a joke, like a little like wink wink to that era, but really just Wolverine wants to hang out with his friends. It reminds me of classic Wolverine as well, who was kind of known for being a flirt back in the day, this whole interaction. And still, even now, sometimes in the present, I feel like he could be a bit of a flirt. Hence here. To be fair though, a lot of the X-Men seemed more flirty in the 90s era in general. Through the voice of Wolverine, Simone also later gets to fire some pot shots at Cyclops, which I honestly enjoyed. I thought it was pretty fun. I like Cyclops, but Wolverine's got some points too. We've seen Scott lead, and sometimes it's great and sometimes it's a problem. I also love the argument that rises out of the conversation between Rogue, Gambit, and Wolverine at the end of this issue, because it felt very organic to me. It felt very true to the characters and just to where they are all at this point. Ultimately, for me, this issue just had it all. It had big action, it had intrigue, it had drama, it had heartache. Seeing the X-Mansion being ripped apart, the loss of Harvey X, who honestly felt like he really represented the endearing and sometimes, let's be honest, annoying fan inside all of us. And even the argument that's at the end of this comic and Rogue's passion and her distress there brought just like a few tears to my eyes. I'm not gonna lie, I teared up reading this issue. And friends, this is only issue number 1. The potential for me to be bawling by the end of this series, based on this first issue, it feels pretty great. It feels like it could happen. We'll see where it goes, but I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of this series, I'm in tears. Hopefully good tears. Hopefully emotional tears and not tears because it went south. The variation this comic provides in terms of places this story takes us just in this one issue is so vast, and it honestly lends to, I think, the overall tone in a great way. From horror to action blockbuster to quiet, intense drama, I loved this ride, and I felt like every element was done so well. Overall, it feels very cinematic. I could honestly, when I was reading it, I could hear a soundtrack in my head when I read the issue. Like, I want this to be a movie. I want this to be an inspiration for something maybe that we get in the MCU. I really love just the overall vibe, the overall ride of us going into all these different paths. And I love horror. I feel like horror and X-Men can fit really well together. I also love a lot of the character designs that we got here. The facial expressions from David Marquez are fantastic. The costumes are classic feeling and superb. And even the layouts help to create a sense of the feeling of a scene and the location that we're in. My love of the art and design elements here also extends to the new characters that we see. Now, let me know how you feel about them in the comments, but for me, I really love that we're getting new mutants who I feel like have some pretty cool and interesting designs. I think Jitter so far is my favorite, just based on the designs we got here, with Fawn being a close second. Poor Fawn. Possibly rest in peace. This is, of course, just based on what we get in this issue for looks, so I don't have a lot that I'm going off of yet, but that's my initial takeaway. The colors also pop throughout the issue, so mad shout out to our colorist here, one of my favorite colorists in, I would say, all of the comic book industry right now, Mathew Wilson. Wilson does it again, as expected. I have a few favorite colorists, and Wilson is up on that list. Like my top 3. And if you know anything about me, you know I'm a sucker for good colors. I love good colors and I love good letters. I mean, they can really change the dynamic of a book, I think. Overall, I'm going to give this comic a 5 out of 5. 5, I don't know, what's in this issue? 5 Sodarangs out of 5? I don't know. 5 somethings out of 5 somethings. 5 X-Men symbols out of 5 X-Men symbols. I loved it. I thought it was perfect. I can't believe how much the team fit in here, and I think it's honestly the most promising issue number 1 thus far that we've seen from the X-Men from the Ashes era, at this point anyways. This is a comic I will be rushing to read, and I cannot wait to see what issue number 2 holds. I was very eager to read this. It just has taken me a while to collect my thoughts and write it all out for you. The one thing I didn't discuss here in this video is the QR code page. Honestly, I'm already tired of these QR codes, but stay tuned, as I'm probably going to have a whole video dedicated to discussing the QR codes and why I feel the way I feel and just kind of talking about them in general at this point. Hopefully, the hype for Uncanny X-Men keeps building with each issue that comes out. Let me know your thoughts on this issue, on From the Ashes and X-Men in general, down in the comments below. Are you here for this? Yes? No? Why? Why not? What are you thinking? How do you feel about the new character designs? How do you feel about new mutants? I need to know. I need to know where you're at. I'll see you in the comments and in the next video. But until then, of course, as always, stay nerdy, friends. Bye!